All right, am I sounding okay back there? Okay, good. Hey, how are you? Good to see you again. My office is next door to his, but we don't see each other anymore. Oh man, I have to come here. I have to come here to see Arden every year too. I'm glad we get to do critical thinking skill 2. And I start thinking about Calvinism and tulip and how many 5-pointers Arden and I agree on. I don't know. Anyway, it's good to see some new faces, and hopefully some of the familiar faces don't mind hearing my very similar dog and pony show that I've done for critical thinking skill number 2 last year and this year. A quote that I have up here that I think is pretty valuable for where my disciplines intersect, that being education and largely history and philosophy, is this notion that if you want to understand something, you need to understand its past. And a big part in that is sources, right? Most of what we know about life we tend to gain from sources, despite John Dewey's best efforts to emphasize experience. There are things that we don't experience and we know to be true. The first one I put up there, obviously I don't mean to insult your intelligence. I think that you know this very well, that almost everything that we know in life comes through sources, and that's why it's so important to talk about them, although our students oftentimes don't think about that. Now, I debated showing, I decided not to when I found out that we were going to video these, but there's a great scene in The Waterboy where Adam Sandler is, yeah, Pee Wee Herman, yeah, no, where Adam Sandler is the water boy and he goes to college, and he's there with his, Southern professor in his bow tie, seersucker suit, and the professor continues to ask questions, and Adam Sandler continues to respond. Do any of you remember, or have you seen, what does he say? Mama says, right? Mama says, over and over. Mama says, crocodiles are mean because they can't smile, or whatever it is that he says. And to which the professor finally responds, Mama's wrong, right? And those are fighting words, and so the scene, goes from there. But anyway, I think it's important for you to talk to your students about how exactly they think of sources. Do they think about their mom or their dad, what they talked about at the dinner table? Are they more interested in journal articles or what they see on the news? Or, what shapes that context of where they get their information and how do they go about looking at it? And in this process is also identifying primary and secondary sources, which can be very, very valuable. And a lot of times students have not yet determined the difference between those two, so it's good to look at it. Regardless of whether it's a primary or a secondary source, there are still a number of basic steps that we determined in North Carolina years ago, right? When we say identifying sources and determining their reliability, what exactly does that mean? The first was to come up with sources, right? Simply write down, where are you going to get information from for this class? What are you going to look for when you seek to answer this question or write this paper? When you do that, ask yourself these questions. To whom is this source addressed, right? That tells you something about the reliability of the source. It doesn't mean it is no longer reliable if you don't like who it's addressed to or you understand the context in which it was given, but it suggests that it might provide you with some evidence about slant, bias, etc. What's the purpose? Is the purpose simply to inform, right? Is it the ultimate kind of modern era truth in science, where historians said, what we can do as historians, we can, when we step into the archives, we remove our own personal biases and we look only at the source and we determine the truth of this source, wherever it may lead? Or is it an understanding of, we always take our biases with us, and good history is an argument, and what argument is being made and how do you use those sources to back that up? Another one is certain presuppositions that people take for granted. what's fact versus opinion. And oftentimes there's the issue of what did someone writing this source leave out. We a lot of times in history, when we're talking about this stuff, we tend to say, and it could apply to many, many different disciplines, we'll say things like, well, a primary source is a letter, right? Because we all know that letters are unbiased, that nobody leaves any information out, that they're perfectly truthful and honest. When we have to say, why did someone leave this out, right? Sometimes the answer is because leaving a piece of information out happens because having that piece of information in the document is detrimental to their argument. It doesn't help their side, whatever that may be. So to get students to think about that when they're looking not only at primary or secondary sources. So this narrow the sources to the most reliable is, I think we can, although we have this as a step, we can take a nuanced look at that and say, we don't necessarily have to cut a source out because we find it biased or because we've determined that this was to this specific audience or it doesn't include this piece of information. Sometimes it is narrowing the sources. We can say, oh, these are no longer good sources. Other times we can say, these are all good sources because they help reveal the complexity of the argument that you may be trying to address. All right, Michael. In terms of evaluating, I may have skipped a page here. Yeah, I did. Sorry. Let me give you an example of an activity where I do this. If you could hand those out. Oftentimes in my class, Foundations of Education or Philosophy of Education class, there you go, Michael. What I will do is we'll talk about the origins of the American public school. Where did this thing start and why? Because I'm trying to get them to think about the context of what they are doing, which is trying to get them to formulate an argument about exactly what are schools for? What's the point of this institution that so much of us spend so many years of our life in? Is there some point? Now, in a textbook, in a foundations textbook like History and Philosophy of American Education, typically here's what you're going to hear about Horace Mann. Horace Mann was the father of the common school. He worked for the state government in Massachusetts with the Board of Education, traversing the state, writing reports, trying to get Massachusetts to buy into the idea that we needed to have free schools, basically what we would call elementary schools, for all the kids in Massachusetts. Free and open to all. And there are a lot of quotes typically in your average textbook about the common school being the great equalizer and the balance wheel of the social machinery and the opportunity to to give immigrants a chance to succeed in American life and these types of things. And none of those things are untrue. Horace Mann did say them all. And many of the people involved in developing common schools in Massachusetts and New England at this time bought into those ideas. But what you typically won't find oftentimes in textbooks about foundations or history of American education sometimes is this, the darker side of American public schooling. And the reason I like to use this source for this activity is because a lot of times, and I'm not attempting to contradict what Arden said a few minutes ago, but a lot of times we say, oh, professional journals. That's where we can find sources that, they have, these are the people we can trust. And I like to use this source because it actually is from a professional journal. It's from the Massachusetts Teacher in 1851. And the problem here for the author is that by 1851, common schools had been started in Massachusetts. They had started spending large sums of money to educate students. And guess what? A lot of the students that they wanted to be in school were not coming, right? We have these free schools. Why are they not coming? And many of those students were Irish Catholic students in Massachusetts. So let me read normally I would have a couple people read this, but since we're on mic here, I will read and skip around a little bit in this. All right, the defects of Irish immigrants from the Professional Teachers Journal of Massachusetts. The constantly increasing influx of foreigners during the last 10 years has been and continues to be a cause of serious alarm to the most intelligent of our own people. What will be the ultimate effect of this vast and unexampled immigration is a problem which has engaged the most anxious thought of our best and wisest men. Will it, immigration that is, like the muddy Missouri as it pours its waters into the clear Mississippi and contaminates the whole united mass, spread ignorance and vice, crime and disease through our native population, right? If you've been to the Mississippi River in Minnesota, you know you can stick your feet in and see them. And if you've been to the Mississippi River near Mississippi, you know that you can't see anything. That's because the confluence of the Missouri River, which is dirt on the bottom, and it kicks it up, and so the Mississippi River is dirty the rest of the way down. And they're saying, is this what immigration is going to do to our country? So they ask, is this going to be our fate? We can't stop these people even if we want to. But if, on the other hand, we can by any means purify this foreign people, enlighten their ignorance, and bring them up to our own level, we shall perform a work of true and perfect charity, blessing the giver and the receiver in equal measure. Our chief difficulty is with the Irish. The Germans, who are next in numbers, will give us no trouble. It's interesting considering the century of history following. They are more obstinate, more strongly wedded to their own notions and customs than the Irish, but they have inherently the redeeming qualities of industry, frugality, and pride, which will save them from vice and pauperism, and they may be safely left to take care of themselves. But the poor Irish, the downtrodden, priest-ridden of centuries, come to us in another shape. So cheaply have they been held at home, so closely have they been pressed down in the social scale, that for the most part the simple virtues of industry, temperance, and frugality are unknown to them. And that wholesome pride which will induce a German or Native American to work hard from sun to sun for the smallest wages rather than seek or accept charitable aid has literally been crushed out of them, right? They won't work hard all day for nothing. We've got problems, people, right? Okay, I'll try and make this short. To understand an evil perfectly is a great point gained toward a remedy. In this case, the principal remedial measure stands out so clearly that there can be no mistaking it. With the old, not much can be done, right? Old people are stuck in their ways. But with their children, the great remedy is education. The rising generation must be taught as our children are taught. We say must be because in many cases this can only be accomplished by coercion. In too many instances, the parents are unfit guardians of their own children. If left to their direction, the young will be brought up in idle, dissolute, vagrant habits which will make them worse members of society than their parents are. And instead of filling our public schools, they will find their way into our prisons, houses of correction, and almshouses. Nothing can operate effectually here but stringent legislation, thoroughly carried out by an efficient police. The children must be gathered up and forced into school, and those who resist or impede this plan, whether parents or priests, italics not mine, must be held accountable and punished, right? The other side of the common school movement. These people are different. We need to make them like us. And Massachusetts shortly thereafter follows and becomes the first state to institute a compulsory school law. Not only providing public schools, but saying that you have to go, right? And then oftentimes we talk about, well then why in the South did common schools not catch on, right? What's the difference here? Well, some of it's weather, right? They can farm longer. The other thing is, right, in the South, the working class in the 1850s, largely slaves, we did not want them, right, to be integrated into the whole, right? People did not want them to view themselves as the same. The difference in the South was we want to make sure these people are different. And so we typically take a piece from a typical textbook against a primary source and say, how does this expand your notion by looking at sources of the good and the bad of public schools? And what challenges does that create for you as you attempt to affirm different races, cultures, backgrounds, religions, SES, all of those different things right, as we try and understand to seek the source of the argument here. And it typically leads to a pretty lively discussion as people talk about what they think about schools. And then the other thing that you can do with a source like this, or what I do with a source like this, is when students read this, they think, how terrible. Thank goodness we don't do anything like this today, at which time you can pull out any article from Chattanooga to this past year. A woman was arrested in Pennsylvania for, I think her daughter missed a couple weeks of school. She took her on vacation without notifying her school, and not to suggest that this individual was a terribly responsible parent of her children, but right, she was arrested. She kept her kids out of school. Right? What does this say about what we think about what schools are really for, and how does that change anything? All right, so that is one example of using sources that I like to use with my class. Here's another one, or let me talk just briefly about evaluation. I put up here sometimes it's as easy as ABC, meaning sometimes you can test whether students know about their sources through something as simple as a multiple choice problem. Oftentimes this may come in the form of a caption or a cartoon or a picture, and you can ask students those exact same questions that I had on a previous slide about to who is this cartoon, speaking, what is the argument that they're trying to make, what have they left out, all of those different things where you can see, are students gaining this skill where they can look at something like that. And then I put up here, it's often as complex as asking, what are schools for? And that is a very detailed paper where you can talk about all kinds of competing interests like the ones I've just given you, and then all the fantastic things that our schools do in fact do that are wonderful. Okay, now I want to talk about just briefly my latest exercise in this effort to talk about sources. Neil Postman, who is, now the late Neil Postman, who wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death and who also wrote a book called The End of Education, which talked about the end or purpose of schools, arguing that if we don't have a good end, it will be the end for this wonderful system that we have. And more in his book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, he talks about one of the dilemmas of video, right? And he says one of the real problems with video is that teachers now use it to teach. And he has a problem with that. He thinks videos, movies, TV, great for entertainment if we would leave it there, but when we start to get into edutainment, where we have to keep everyone happy at all times and entertained and whatever else. And he says the real problem with that is that videos by and large, and what I want you to think about is using videos as a source. Oftentimes we don't apply the same kind of scrutiny that we have, or at least our students don't, to a video source that they would on paper. And he says, right, that there are no prerequisites, no perplexities, and no dialogue in videos. And that's a very important thing to remember when you use them as a hook or a set in your class or whatever else. No perplexity. Television is designed so that when you turn it on, you know what's going on. Because if you don't, what happens? You change it, right? You turn it off. It's over. We're done with this. So they have to design it at a certain level where there's no prerequisites. Nobody designs a television show and then says, now before you watch this, would you go read these 3 books? And then we'll come back and talk about this stuff. The second thing that he says is that there's no perplexity. That by and large our television, even educational television, is designed to sum everything up nicely rather than sometimes reveal the complexity of a situation. So our students go home and they turn on Fox News or CNN or whatever it is that they watch, and they see something about Libya. And it's a 90-second segment, and when they're done watching it, they understand. They understand what's going on. in Libya or in Egypt or wherever it may be that the latest crisis is that we're facing. They pretty much have their view, and we understand it, right? And just as an aside, CNN and Fox News and the media wars are this fantastic example of sources, right? And this fantastic evidence that you can use with your students, whether they say, I love this network and I hate this one, is the valuable lesson of, listen, these different people can report on the exact same thing and might not be lying at all, and yet can tell two very, very different stories. And so how do we look at that? And then finally, that there's not a lot of dialogue. That when you're done with the video, largely what happens is, okay, I've got it. And that tends to lend itself toward this lack of dialogue. Okay, I've got the information, what's next? So I like to show a little clip in my class to kind of reveal this to them. Let's see what we can do here.
School desegregation.
Where did my good friend Michael go? Let me try one last thing here. Okay, this segment here that I'm about to show you deals with busing in schools. And I want you to think about what some of the people say and what you sense in their argument here.
All northern cities were engaged in discriminatory practices, and historically, almost all of them have been engaged in massive discrimination, both in the way they ran their schools and in the way they ran their policies that shaped the residential pattern of their neighborhoods.
The northern school boards, for instance, would zone schools in a way that they would locate schools in areas to intensify segregation. At the same time, there were no policies, no regulations, no laws that compelled them to do that. And so, because you've had this kind of institutionalized form of discrimination, it's very difficult to change it.
In 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that busing children within city limits was a lawful remedy for segregation. Busing was used successfully to create more racially balanced schools in many cities.
School desegregation is a feasible policy that is very popular when it's implemented properly. And we have some cities in the country that have done it substantially enough and thoroughly enough so that actually both races understand its importance. Most people whose children have been bused say it was a very satisfactory experience.
But in Detroit, Michigan, there weren't enough white children left to make busing possible. Years of middle-class flight to the suburbs had left Detroit schools over 70% minority and desperately underfunded. Just across the Detroit line, a healthy tax base supported a louder school system. Schools in suburban Detroit offered students a rich array of courses and extracurricular activities. So in 1972, a federal judge ordered a radical remedy. Bus the suburban students into the city and Detroit students out to the suburbs. Nearly 800,000 students would be affected.
Our parents had moved out here into a good school district to give us a decent education, I wouldn't mind having them bused here, but I don't like the fact of going way out of my way and into a high crime district.
But it's not that much violence up there, you can see that.
But I don't want to go there.
You don't want to go wild.
I'd rather stay at the school I am.
No one would go. No one would agree with it. No one would do it.
How could you keep from going?
Easy, just don't get on the bus. While Detroit's busing plan made its way to the Supreme Court, the political climate was shifting. Busing, even within city limits, aroused growing controversy nationwide
We're number one.
and became a popular target for politicians.
We have found that where we have heavy reliance on cross-city busing of school children, it has failed to meet either of its intended purposes. It's failed to promote quality education for all. It's failed to end the racial isolation, which we all agree must be ended.
In 1974, exactly 2 decades after Brown, a conservative Supreme Court struck down the Detroit case. The suburbs bore no responsibility for conditions in urban schools, the court said. Any plan to desegregate would be limited to the city itself. Lawyer Thurgood Marshall had spent a lifetime championing the cause of school integration. Now a Supreme Court justice, he sharply dissented in the Detroit decision.
In the short run, it may seem the easier course to allow our great metropolitan areas to be divided up into 2 cities, one white, the other black. But it is a course, I predict, our people will ultimately regret. For unless our children begin to learn together, there is little hope that our people will ever learn to live together.
Okay, so taking these ideas about sources and applying them to this, what did you see, what did you notice about anybody's argument? Right. Which opinions might have been less, have less correspondence with reality than others? Particularly the guy at the beginning who says, hey, if you talk to people who were bused, pretty much they found it satisfactory. It was a good thing, you know, right? That, okay, Brown v. Board, segregation is unconstitutional, fine. Then the next step, busing, right? That's a whole different level, a whole different ballgame in many respects in terms of support from both the African American community as well as suburbs. But the other thing that I like to show students, and I'm sorry for the time here, I'll let you out in about 60 seconds, are the less visible arguments that are being made here. Okay.
It's failed to end the racial isolation, which we all
And I asked them, did any of you, when you watch this, think about the music that's being played here about the source and the argument? It's like, somebody's dying, right? This was the wrong decision, you know. Busing across city lines is horrible. But then, the right answer, we have it.
Championing the cause of school integration.
Yeah. There's an argument being made there in a source about what you're supposed to think about a documentary about public schooling. And of course, there are all kinds of incredible constitutional dilemmas that other justices pointed out in this case. And they were saying, hey, we want integration. We want these different things. The issue is the federal government, according to the Constitution, cannot tell the residents of Chattanooga, to use an example closer to home, that their kids must, by law, go to Ottawa. And that the kids in Ottawa cannot be told, right, they have a city government there. And we're going to take them across the city government lines and take them somewhere else. And well, if that's the case, why don't we talk about Dalton and Cleveland and what we can mix up across state lines? And if that's the case, what about, border towns in Mexico and impoverished children there? Right, and constitutionality versus what you want to see happen and those different things. All kinds of incredible arguments to ask students that often get left out if we don't think about video as a source to apply these same types of ideas to. Any questions for me? Feel pretty comfortable with that? Hopefully those examples were helpful. Michael, I don't know how that's going to apply to.
That's with environmental science.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of folks get their environmental science from fooding,
Uh-huh.
from gaslands, whatever the fracking one is, and there's lots of videos that
Mm-hmm.
inform.
Yes.
Maybe.
Right. Yeah. Inform and misinform. Sometimes we need to learn and relearn and talk about that process as well. All right. Well, thank you for your time. It's so good to see you all. All right. Oh, welcome to Moe's.